Well, thank you very much indeed, Jane, and for extending the privilege of being able to make a few opening remarks at this Making Nature Count conference. I think this is one of the moments when you realize that conservation is beginning to change. I come to this whole discussion as an environmentalist, not as an economist. I spent the last 35 years advocating and campaigning for the protection of the natural environment, and I think we're in a phase where things are beginning to alter. And I think this is a good thing, because I spent quite a lot of time over the years wondering why it's so difficult to make progress on what seems to be a very straightforward proposition that we need to be reducing our impact on the systems that sustain us. And if you think about the way in which we've done that as an environmental community, we've made a moral case, we've marshaled lots of technical information and presented a scientific case at the same time, and yet these two things don't yet seem to have been sufficient to turn the tide of rising human demand upon a diminishing resource base and upon ever more stressed ecosystems, including the planet's atmosphere. So if you look at why we continue to head in what is, from a scientific perspective, and also arguably from a moral perspective, the wrong direction, I think ultimately you come back to a failure of economics, because we've fallen into the trap over many decades of seeing the liquidation of the natural environment really as the price of progress, an inevitable, regrettable, but nonetheless unavoidable consequence of what we have to do to grow the economy, achieve competitiveness, end poverty. And so we've seen a balance, really, if not a trade-off, between growing economics and diminishing ecology. And this has seemed perfectly rational until you start to take a more economic view of this, because what we've done is we've assumed that actually what we're taking is a flow of benefits, when in fact what we're doing, of course, is we're liquidating the stocks. And in economics, this is a basic distinction between what you see as the dividends, your interest, if you will, and then what you see as your capital assets. In the case of the planet's capital assets, the oceans, the wetlands, the forests, the carbon stores in peat, and the biodiversity, we are liquidating them, having made the monumental mistake that actually this is a flow of benefits when in fact it is the destruction of the capital. And so for me, this is a really important conceptual twist in terms of how we look at the conservation agenda going forward. And this is not to say for a nanosecond that the moral argument becomes diminished in any way, or that the scientific one somehow is sidelined. This is about closing a gap in a range of arguments that need to be put before the world simultaneously: the spiritual, the aesthetic, the moral, the scientific, and the economic on top of that. And I think if we can do this, then I think we can begin to transform outcomes by transforming behavior. And in the end, this is all about transforming behavior and doing things differently in terms of how we relate to natural systems. A few examples that I've seen, having written extensively about these subjects over the last few years. One from this island of Ireland. Recently went on a visit to the Dungonal water treatment works next to the Garum Plateau in Antrim, one of the largest areas of blanket bog left in Northern Ireland. Those of you who are conservationists or ecologists will know that blanket bog is one of the most extensive semi-natural ecosystems across the British Isles. It's accumulated a layer of peat that goes back to the end of the last ice age, and that peat, to many people, has looked like a wasteland. Those of us who are interested in nature and wildlife would go to such a place and we'd see a marsh saxifrage, a very rare plant. We might see a merlin, a small bird of prey. We might hear the call of a curlew, and we would be inspired by that. But unfortunately, quite a lot of people aren't, which is why, over centuries, the degradation of the British Isles blanket bogs has been pretty extensive. Most of them are in what is described by the scientific community as an unfavorable condition. Burning, overgrazing, drainage in order to be able to facilitate agriculture, and in the case of Dartmoor in southwest England, being used for target practice before the First World War by dreadnought battleships stationed in Plymouth Sound, firing 16-inch artillery shells up there to see if they had the range right. They did have the range right, and the peat got blasted to smithereens. Such is the abuse of these systems that look to so many people like wastelands. They don't have any value, literally a wasteland, until you start to see this through a different prism. Certainly, let's look at the merlin and the saxifrage and the curlew as very good reason to save those places and to protect them, but recognize also that there's a further argument we can make, and to some eyes, that argument actually is quite compelling. And in this case, the water treatment works had realized that actually there was a very important ecosystem service being provided by the capital asset of the blanket bog. And rather than permit the continuing degradation of the blanket bog, it was decided to invest to make the capital asset stronger. So there were small expenditures incurred in reducing the grazing pressure, preventing burning, blocking up the drains. I saw this place a couple of years after work had begun, and the sphagnum moss was already beginning to heal scars of impacts that were inflicted on this place many decades ago. And the reason the water company wanted to do this was to get cleaner water supply. So those of you who've drunk water coming from a blanket bog without it going through a water treatment works will notice that it's brown and full of particles. Not only quite unpleasant for most people, actually a bit of a health hazard too, and so you need to get that out. In the case of the Dungonal water treatment works and every other place in the British Isles where we're taking water from degrading peatlands, you've got a choice. You can either improve the quality of the peat or you can invest in technology. And so in this case, quantities of ammonium sulfate being used in settling tanks to remove the brown liquid, which then is put into trucks and taken to a landfill site. That's one way of doing it, quite expensive, not very environmentally friendly from the point of view of carbon in terms of the chemical use and the transport. Alternatively, you can spend some money restoring the blanket bog, and this is what Northern Ireland Water decided to do at that treatment works, because that was the catchment that was feeding those tanks with the brown water. Progressively, the water will become less brown, and that's not the only water company that has seen this as a sensible business strategy. And actually what you find is not only is this augmenting the quality of the bog and actually reducing costs over time, this is a cheaper thing to do, to restore the capital asset of the natural feature, but actually a series of co-benefits come for society at the same time. Those co-benefits include the bog stopping being a source of CO2. One of the biggest land-based emission sources we have in the British Isles is the degradation of peatlands. About 10 million tonnes of carbon per year coming from that source into the atmosphere. This is huge. You start looking at that in terms of numbers of wind turbines and solar panels we need, you would think, why do we possibly tolerate this? A benefit right there. Some peatlands across Britain, and I know from Exmoor and the work that South West Water has been doing with the wildlife trusts there in the so-called Upstream Thinking initiative, not only have they managed to get cleaner water for public supply, but have also improved economically important salmon and trout fisheries, at the same time as locking up carbon, and crucially, from the point of view of what we now know about climate change, have hugely reduced flood risk downstream from Exmoor, where they've been restoring the blanket bogs. Multiple benefits layered on top of one another, simply through taking a different view of how we look at these ecosystems. Are they important for birds? Yes, of course they are. Can we get multiple other benefits by conserving the habitat of the birds? Yes, we can. That seems to me to be a really important change in perspective, and is almost a revelation when you think about how we have become used to doing business over recent decades, where we've been told repeatedly by chief executives, by chancellors, by prime ministers, that the environmental damage that many of us are concerned about is the price of progress necessary for growth. When you start to look at it through these different prisms, actually you realize that that is not true, and we've got good evidence to show that. And then water, a fundamental aspect of how our world runs. Of course, alongside that is food, another fundamental benefit that we take from ecosystems. Obviously, highly modified ecosystems. Most of the soils that we depend upon for food in Britain used to be covered with forests. We removed the forests, modified the ecosystem, simplified them, turned them into grasslands for the most part, growing cereals. And that, of course, has led to a series of environmental impacts and also a degradation of the basic resource that we need to sustain long into the future for our food supply, namely the soil. We've also been degrading the pollinators that are responsible for much of the food production. Grains are one thing, being pollinated by the wind, fruits and vegetables quite another. They depend, for the most part, on pollinating insects, mostly bees, but also beetles, wasps, and other insects. But again, you can see the narrative being flipped in relation to this too. One case I know about concerns a company called Thatcher's Cider down in Somerset. I know this is the land of Guinness, and it may be heresy to talk about cider, but nonetheless, let me share this story with you very briefly. So Thatcher's is one of the companies who you would think is the kind of firm that we want to see more of in the west of Europe these days, in terms of generating jobs, building profitability, being able to bring prosperity to communities. They turn over about £60 million a year. They've grown about 20% a year since the financial crisis. I'm not sure that says something about our state of mind as we look at the state of the economy and actually need more cider. Nonetheless, they've been doing extremely well, and by exporting too. And they've done this through having a very good brand, through having a very good supply chain, through having modern technology. But when I went to speak to Martin Thatcher, the managing director of the company, who showed me around the orchards where they grow the apples and pears that they make to the cider and to the perry, I said to him, you know, what's the basic business model here? And he described what was the basic idea. And he told me that the most fundamental thing that they depend upon is not the labeling, the brand and the kegs and the supply chain, it's bumblebees. The man had seen the light, because obviously apples are pollinated by insects. He'd discovered that actually the wild insects were better pollinators than the domesticated honeybees. And even if the domesticated honeybees were doing some of the work, they were still relying mainly on wild pollinators, as appears to be the case across the British Isles, where even though we have quite a thriving beekeeping community, we're still mainly reliant on wild insects for the pollination of the foods that we need to eat. And especially when you hear advice about eating more fruits and vegetables, there is actually a connection there to these pollinators. They are pretty essential in being able to produce this source of food. So what Martin Thatcher had done, not seeing the protection of the bumblebees as a cost, but as an investment, he'd begun to get his people to start widening the grassland headlands next to the hedges and to begin thickening the hedges, to leave the old trees in the hedgerows, to start planting new trees and small woodlands in the corners, to be putting small wetlands and ponds back. And the reason for this was to encourage insects. This is perhaps a slightly odd idea for some people in agriculture, but for him it made perfect sense, and indeed he's beginning to see species that were long lost from that part of Somerset coming back, working with the Bumblebee Conservation Trust to encourage not only pollination services, but also a conservation benefit in being able to restore the populations of declining animals. Very good story, I thought. And also one where he began to tell me what he thought was an additional benefit he was getting from these kinds of interventions through natural pest control. He noted that the old trees with holes in the hedgerows were attracting bats and also more songbirds. And we know from the scientific literature that we can expect there to be a benefit. In the United States, bats have been shown to be bringing several $1 billion worth of value per year by avoiding the use of chemicals in agriculture. And we know from studies in the Netherlands that grape tits are a very effective way of controlling insects during critical periods, leading to lower fruit damage and higher yields in the autumn. All this stuff, of course, we can't see very easily. We can see the balance sheet, we can see the sale of the chemicals, we can see the profitability of the chemical companies. Very often we're blinded to the role of bees, birds, and bats, however. But in some places we can see it, and intuitively we know actually this is the case. Similarly, in the sea, still get a lot of our food from the oceans around Britain. We're getting about half as much as we got in the 1940s, however. And I think, rather like the bumblebee, we need to understand that the fish don't live in isolation. The bumblebee doesn't simply live in the air, and the fish don't simply live in the water. They're parts of ecosystems, and the more we degrade the ecosystems, it's unsurprising that perhaps then we get less from them. And in case of the fisheries around the British Isles, not only have we taken out much of the spawning biomass, that's led to lower catches, but also we've destroyed much of the ecosystem features that actually sustain animals like cod. So cod need food. They eat worms and crabs. When they get big, they eat fish like mackerel. All of that needs to be there in order to get a good catch of cod. And what we've done, of course, through the way in which we've been fishing is to damage some of these features. Beam trawling. We've been doing it now for about 150 years around Britain, especially around the North Sea coast, and we've smashed the seabed to pieces. And is this good for fisheries? Well, in the long term, probably not. It's a bit like endlessly ploughing the grasslands where a bumblebee lives. In the end, you won't finish up with many bumblebees. So what can we do? I mean, the fishing industry is notoriously resistant against the Greens and the environmentalists calling for restraint in terms of how this industry works. But actually, I was very pleased to find examples through my research of people who've seen the light and actually understand that restoring the ecosystem is probably the best way of restoring catches. One example I have is from Brixham in Devon, where the trawler fleet down there a few years ago began experimenting with different ways of catching fish by reducing the damage caused by the beam trawlers that's being taken across the seabed. There's a very simple innovation they started with was basically to put wheels on the end of the beam trawl to take it across the sea floor without it actually smashing into the seabed. And would you believe, not only did they catch fish, but they actually found their businesses to be more profitable for two reasons. That was because they were managing the two biggest costs to the fishing fleet. One was diesel. They needed much less of it because they didn't need to drag the net through rocks. They went over the top. And the second thing they saved money on was nets, because they discovered they last twice as long if you get them to coast over the seabed than rather than smash into it. And so they were making about £200 per week more per crew member per vessel as a result of innovating in ways to protect the natural capital asset. This, to me, is, I think, the beginning of really quite a big change in how we look at our relationship to the natural environment and how we look at conservation. Because the more we can see that nature actually is sustaining economic benefit and development rather than getting in the way of it, which is how sometimes this is presented, then I think the quicker we make progress towards some better outcomes. But what does this mean for the way in which we look at these issues? I think for some environmentalists, and certainly good friends of mine, over time we've kind of seen capitalism to be part of the problem in terms of how we look at the protection of the natural environment into the future. And when you put the phrase natural capital in front of some, it naturally generates an anti-reaction. This must be wrong, because we've seen capitalism's depredations destroying the natural environment, and we have seen that through the opening of countries' economies, the privatization of different elements of the natural environment, the clearance of natural forests to make way for palm oil in order to be able to generate a return for a capital investment. All of this actually is right. But then again, you can look at it a different way, because if you start to think about how capital has been allowed to create these drastic changes to the composition of the atmosphere, to the status of tropical forests, to fish stocks, if you think of how that's been possible to do, then you're kind of thinking, well, actually, they've only done it because a lot of the real impacts have been hidden. And once you start to lay out the full value of nature, and then you start to see what's happening as a result of different decisions being made by economic entities in relation to those assets, then actually I think you start to hold capitalism to account. This is actually a different outcome to which many expected. Because once you start laying out the numbers, and once you start calling on people to explain their impact, then some of the decisions they're beginning to make don't look that rational. And hopefully that's when you can start to build the kind of momentum towards the changes that we need to see. And actually there's some very good work going on in this space already in making decisions accountable. We have the Natural Capital Protocol already being now shared by the Natural Capital Coalition. We have Mark here who will be explaining more about that later on. We have Dieter Helm's work with the British government and the Natural Capital Committee being able to bring to the heart of the British government, and actually crucially to the heart of the British Treasury, no less, the state of Britain's changing natural capital assets with numbers attached, inviting ministers to be thinking about accounting protocols to make more rational decisions, which might begin to affect the state of the blanket bogs, the pollinators, the fish, the carbon stores, and everything else. So I think this is a very exciting time, and one that we need to embrace as different communities of actors, whether we're in local authorities, in national government, in campaign groups, or in business, and to begin to realize the benefits of this particular agenda, and indeed the huge opportunities therein. Like every venture that has such complexity and such breadth, however, of course, there are dangers. But I would say that the bigger danger is kept inside the idea of nature being separate from the economy. The longer we perpetuate that particular myth, then I think the harder we will find it to be able to rise to the challenge at hand. We're rapidly heading towards a global population of 9 billion. The economy is growing very rapidly in different parts of the world. The demands that we're making on the natural resource base and the atmosphere are growing ever greater year by year. If we continue to deplete the natural capital assets that currently sustain human welfare, then I don't think we can look forward to a very bright human future. Should we, however, realize in time that actually the economy is 100% owned by ecology and not the other way round, then perhaps we've got some prospect for a bright future. Thank you very much indeed. must be some dissenters, surely.
How you doing? Andrew St. Ledger of the Environmental Pillar. Do you also believe there's a need for having a baseline in terms of the naturalness of each environment, just based on the understanding that our environment is seriously degraded?
Yeah.
And before we start putting value, commodifying nature, should we not first of all know the state, the true state of our environment? Yeah. Ireland has the least natural environment in Europe, according to a Forest Europe report of 2011.
Yeah.
In terms of naturalness indicators.
Yes.
So unless we have that to begin with, it's kind of aspirational, and we're going off on a tangent.
Yes.
There also needs to be a plan to restore the state of the natural environment.
Yes.
A plan with targets alongside accounting for natural capital, that we need to account for the damage that's been done and how we're going to fix it using profits from natural capital.
Yes. I think my first reaction would be that probably we know quite a lot already about the state of nature and the extent to which we have almost nothing natural left in this part of the world, and the same prevails in the UK. And so, obviously we need to share that knowledge as widely as possible, but the more important question, which you allude to, I think, is what we do about it and how we begin on a program of large-scale restoration. And so, I'm delighted to see that both in the UK and in some of the cases that I'm involved with in the tropics, there is now much more of an emphasis on restoration alongside conserving what's left. And so this is for all sorts of reasons, some of them to do with pure, what you might call nature conservation, but others to do with the restoration of water supply and the capture of carbon, which are probably more in the natural capital space. And it seems to me that one of the jobs we've got as a conservation community is to be able to align what we want to do for birds, tigers, fish, and everything else with what now seems to be like a more rational economic agenda from the point of view of water and carbon. And so that's where I think we can begin to get into restoration. And then once you start to look at that broad idea, then obviously it becomes a question of how you start to move the tools in to do that and the financial incentives and everything else. And so, for instance, I think what we should be doing in Europe right now, looking at restoration, is to be taking a substantial proportion of, if not the whole of, the common agricultural policy budget to be restoring natural capital, rather than spending it as we do right now destroying natural capital, whether that be pollinators or soils. So I think once we get into that space, then I think we can start to have a much more meaningful discussion about how we move the resources in that direction. Hopefully we're getting there. We can see the start of it in some places at least. I mentioned water in the UK and the extent to which now blanket bog restoration, for example, great example of a natural, semi-natural habitat that's trashed. People are now beginning to put resources into restoration, mostly for water, but with these co-benefits there as well.
Raul MP Sosteneo. Thank you very much, Tony, and I really enjoyed your book. That got me introduced to this whole topic, so
marvelous.
Indebted to you for that. Thank you. My question really relates, it's kind of a broad question. We've seen emissions rise for the last 26 years despite our intergovernmental meetings.
Yes.
And our carbon budget is pretty much there. We've got all the reserves left to complete that bubble or budget, and then we're exceeding 2 degrees. How do you think, or do you have faith that natural capital can turn the tide where all other systems and perhaps protocols seem to have failed?
I think, as I hopefully said at the start, it's one component. It's one bit of the jigsaw. On the climate side of things, there is a massive moral, social justice agenda there, which really should be driving the politics, and to an extent does. But then again, as you correctly point out, we found out that that's not enough yet. And we're going to need to be invoking some other dimensions to this. And, I was over dinner yesterday evening discussing the intervention of the Stern Review 10 years ago this month, and how suddenly the climate issue was not only about justice and morality and the future, it also then became one about economics. And I think that has helped move things along. And if you look at what happened in the Paris summit at the end of last year, it was very interesting. You know, it wasn't just my former colleagues at Friends of the Earth and friends at Greenpeace who were there calling for action. We had some of the world's largest multinational companies and banks there calling for action. And I think that's one reason why we actually got the treaty, because there was an economic dimension that had been brought in there by big economic actors. And if you look back to Kyoto, actually, the summit in Japan in '97, I was there campaigning for Friends of the Earth International, and we had the most enormous big battle with those very same companies who said, don't create global targets, don't create costs for us, because on the one hand, it doesn't look like it's even real, and on the other, even if it is, leave it to the market. And these people thought at the time, this is '97, that actually there was, on the one hand, environmental targets, and on the other, economic growth, and this would interfere with that. By 2015, they'd actually realized that unless you meet the environmental targets, there is no economy. And that is actually quite a big shift of perspective that led those companies to turn up and then say to the governments, please come with a treaty very quickly. And not only did they say 2 degrees, they said 1.5. And I think that actually is worth reflecting on why that happened and how that change took place over that period. And I think it is because of the economic dimension being inserted. But I cannot say strongly enough how we have to be vigilant not to let the economics take away everything else, because the reasons we want to do this are diverse. We want to have a moral perspective, we want to have a spiritual perspective, an aesthetic, a scientific one, and an economic one. And I, for one, think we can do that. I don't think it's either or. And that's the thing to keep an eye on, I would say.
Hi, I'm Sylvia Thompson from the Irish Times. You mentioned the Common Agricultural Policy budget. And I suppose, how would you see that as one area that needs to be tackled in terms of transparency with subsidies, and
Yes.
how will that, help the natural capital agenda?
So at the moment, the common agricultural subsidies make relatively small play of the need to restore ecosystems. So there's the so-called Pillar 2 funding, which does go towards these agri-environment schemes, but the far bigger body of the money is being spent supporting industrial agriculture of different kinds, whether that's overgrazing in the uplands, causing damage to wetlands, for example, like blanket bogs, or whether it's excessive ploughing and cropping in the lowlands using very intensive chemical treatments, which is leading to insect populations being wiped out. You know, the public are paying for this. And I think the more we know about natural capital, the more we can see that actually what we should be expecting from policymakers is for public monies to be spent on public benefit. And public benefit would include reduced flood risk. The way we're ploughing soils is making flooding worse by blocking up rivers. Another public benefit we might like is cheap water, so not having to remove chemicals and pesticides and slug pellets from water before public supply. That's a cost that's passed on to the consumer, either via taxes or bills, depending on how the water is being charged for. And then, of course, the problem of carbon. We're loading the atmosphere with CO2, much of which is coming from reduced soil organic matter, both on peatlands and also agricultural soils. All these things, in turn, have huge costs to society, and yet we're encouraging those costs to be made bigger by the way in which we're spending farming money. And I think once you start looking at the natural capital values that are being lost, then you realize that this is not rational. And actually, in the case of the United Kingdom, having taken this interesting decision to leave the European Union, we're now about to find ourselves in a series of bilateral trade negotiations, and inevitably, high on the list with partners who we would like to negotiate new trade deals with will be the question of subsidies. And I think probably the British government might be quite wise to begin turning farm subsidies into payments for ecosystem services quite quickly if it wishes to be able to pay its farmers at all. It's a slightly different UK perspective on it, but one that I think probably will become apparent in the coming months.
Thank you, Tony.
My pleasure. Thank you.